Story.
Okay, without any further ado, welcome, Eric. I'll let you introduce yourself and the book and take it away.
Okay, well, I'm Eric Redman. I'm very flattered, honored to have you here. Deirdre worked really hard to get it all set up, and then she decided to go for a hike. So that shows you how much she cared about this whole thing. Hi, Deirdre, you're recording. You're going to watch this recording. My wife and I have owned a place in the Methow Valley since the year 2000, actually. And our place is out on, if you know where Stud Horse Mountain is, you know where the golf course is. We're across the road, the Bear Creek Road. We're south. We're the hill that is south of Stud Horse, and it is and just west of Davis Lake. So Davis Lake is actually part of our property. A little bit of Davis Lake is part of our property. So we have that whole big hill there, and it's smaller than Stud Horse, so we call ours Disappointing Colt Hill, and that's the land we've had for a long time. We recently have put it on the market, and it was not a good time to put it on the market, as you can imagine, because anybody who came to visit it couldn't see it because it was covered in smoke. But we've spent many years. It's just a little tiny A-frame cabin that was built by our predecessor, Peter Cipra. And we've spent a lot of years and a lot of money restoring the native vegetation there. Long ago, people broke the sod and did dryland farming there, but then when it was abandoned, it all went into weeds. And so we worked with Sam Lucy, probably a lot of you know Sam, to do a non-chemical restoration of the original grasslands. And we drilled a well to provide water for restoring trees and other vegetation to provide cover for the animals. And it's a very large piece of property. It's 445 acres. And it's a really great place that we love dearly. But we've reached a point in life where we're just not getting there enough. And when we do go at this stage in life, the fact is my wife would rather stay at Sun Mountain Lodge and hear the clink of glasses in a restaurant than be confined with me in this little 600 square foot A-frame cabin, where I actually love being confined with her there, but that's not her idea of how to go spend time in the Met House. So that's why the place is on the market. As far as the book goes, well, I think the book, one thing I've learned from writing a book and writing a novel is that once you publish it, the characters belong to the reader. They don't belong to me anymore. And I've been fortunate to have 3 or 4 different book clubs I've had the opportunity to meet with and hear from. I've also probably received in total maybe 100 personal communications from people, some of them obviously friends, but a lot of them from people I don't know at all. And so that's obviously a self-selected group. People who hate the book or who think you're awful don't send you a letter to tell you that. So it's not, I don't think that these are representative samplings, but it's been really interesting to hear reactions of people to the book and to the characters. And I hope I'll talk, but I hope I get that you'll all take time to talk, because I'd really like to hear from you about it. I had never written a novel before. When I was very young, I started out my career working for Senator Magnuson, and I worked for Senator Magnuson on a lot of things, but one was a bill that created the National Health Service Corps. And I was the staff aide assigned to it. And that bill had the most dramatic passage through Congress that you could possibly imagine. So when it was done, even though I hadn't thought about writing a book, I wrote a book about that called The Dance of Legislation, which was published in 1973. And completely unexpectedly, it became a big bestseller, and it's still in print. And as soon as that book became a bestseller, Simon & Schuster wanted me to write another book right away. And I wanted to write another book right away. I had finished law school, and I didn't go to work as a lawyer. I sat down and started to write a novel. And I even had a contract from Simon & Schuster for the novel. But a fellow who had been my mentor, had been my boss when I worked for Senator Magnuson and so forth, pleaded with me to come to work as a lawyer to help him out at a particular time. So I went out in 1975. I dropped what I was doing, and I became a lawyer. And I never got back to that novel that I was trying to write. So in the intervening years between 1975 and the publication of this book, which is a lot of years, that's 45 years, I guess, I wrote a tremendous number of articles. I wrote for journals, I wrote for magazines, I wrote for newspapers, I wrote for academic journals, I wrote law review articles. I was a longtime book reviewer for the New York Times and for the Washington Post. I was a contributing editor of Rolling Stone magazine. But I never wrote any fiction. I never had a chance because I was working full time. I started going out to the Big Island in the early 1980s for vacation, and then I would my children loved it so much when they were little. I would manage to be out in South Kohala for about 6 weeks of the year. And my wife, Heather, had one aunt and one uncle who each went out to Hawaii when they were 20 years old, and they each married a native Hawaiian. And as a result, and they each had 4 children. So as a result, my wife, Heather, has 8 native Hawaiian first cousins. So the way Hawaii works, those are my first cousins too, part of the Ohana. And sorry, got a phone call coming there. And they were really wonderful, wonderful people. But of course, like all Hawaiians, they give their kids these amazing names. So Kuele, you notice little Kuele in the book, the 11-year-old cousin of Kavika. In real life, Kuele's name is Kuele Aloha Anelamai Kalani Wang Kaokai. So these names are so delightful. Her father is Kavika, in real life, Kavika Kaokai. These names are so delightful that my wife and I started thinking that it would be fun to do. I don't think we really planned to do it, but we talked about a sort of a comical or lighthearted murder mystery series set in Hawaii. So you'd have Murder at the Mauna Lani, Mayhem at the Mauna Kea, Horror at Hualalai, and so forth, with sort of fun. We'd have a detective named Kavika, and we'd have lots of improbable situations, because really most Hawaiian detective fiction, that's what it is. It's lighthearted stuff for people to read on the beach, basically. And there's a lot of really good stuff. There's a lot of really good Hawaiian detective fiction like that, that's lighthearted, that isn't really about Hawaiian people. It's just about, taking advantage of this exotic landscape and stuff. And so we joked about that. And then in October of 2001, almost 20 years to the day from today, my best friend and my brother-in-law for 30 years, Tom Wales, who was an assistant U.S. attorney in Seattle, he was murdered in his home here in Seattle. And when you have a real life murder in the family, and probably some of you have experienced that just statistically, in my case, it was the second murder in our family. So when there's a real murder, you don't, there's no humor in it, obviously. It's exactly the opposite. And we were on the Big Island a few months after the murder, and I read in the Seattle Times online, someone in the investigation, there was a quote in the paper saying that, from someone close to the federal investigation, saying, sometimes you know who committed the crime, but you can never bring them to trial. And I was absolutely furious by that quote, because I recognized, who must have given it, and I knew why they had given it, which is they were trying to tell this murderer to back off, that he didn't need to kill any more people. Everybody involved, everybody close to the scene, knew who the murderer was in the first hour of Tom's murder, and now it's 20 years later, and no one has been indicted or tried. There's been a 20-year-long FBI investigation that's been going on this whole time. But the minute that happened and I read that quote, I realized as a family member, you can give information to the FBI, but you don't get information back. You don't know, there's no flow out from the investigation out to the family. There's only information going in. And I decided to actually write a murder mystery, but I was going to use this murder mystery to do the part that I could do, which was to avenge myself against this murderer who I knew who it was. So some of you probably, I've never been to a book club where everybody had finished the book, and sometimes people had, started late and didn't get to the end. And when you talk about a murder mystery, it's kind of hard to discuss the whole book without dealing with the murderer. So for those of you who need a spoiler alert, here comes the spoiler alert. But what I wanted to do in that character of Fortunato in the book was I made Fortunato the voodoo doll for the actual murder of my brother-in-law, and I really wanted to, on the page, I wanted to get, you know, revenge for that killing, because I couldn't do it in real life. I was kicking my tiny little foot against the massive shin of a federal criminal investigation, and in a way, you know, if just the FBI read it and just the people in the Justice Department read it, you know, I'd be happy, because part of me was, you know, wanted to say to them, guys, you know, this guy who killed Tom, you know who it is to a moral certainty. You know who did it. You know that he's a heavily armed Second Amendment gun fanatic. And it just seems to me that the simple thing is that he manages to die while resisting arrest. I mean, isn't that the way it should come out? But of course, you can't actually say that to them, and they won't do that. So that's why I kind of had to use the book for that. So that's why the book took on a serious tone. But there were a lot of other things too about detective fiction. I read a lot of detective fiction. You could probably tell that from reading the book. But I'm not a fan of a couple of things. I'm particularly not a fan of the aha moment, the moment where everything is revealed. And in this book, I wanted the identity of the murderer to emerge slowly for the reader and slowly for Kavika, the detective, so that there's no one point when you realize for sure who the murderer is. It's just a growing accumulation of things that leads you to that conclusion. And I hope that was achieved. And then, of course, in this book, I had something else, which was in most detective fiction, once the aha moment has occurred, you know, you're probably 25 or 30 pages from the end of the book. Here, there was a lot of other things I wanted to have happen. So I think if you've read the book, probably you knew who the murderer was long before you got to the end of the book. So it wasn't so much the identity of the murderer as, you know, the how and the why and what was behind it all. How other people were involved, how other people reacted to it, you know, how Kavika would deal with discovering it, how his boss Tanaka would deal with it. Those were all things that I wanted to also do. So structurally, that's the way that I went about that. I had to do some other things structurally as well, and I'm sure many of you picked up on this. There's certain iron rules of detective fiction. One is the murderer can't be a minor character who's introduced late in the book. That's unfair to the reader to do that. So if the murderer, and in real life murder, you know who did it. Usually you know right off the bat, you know who the murderer is as soon as the murder occurs practically. There's usually not much confusion about who the murderer is unless it's a murder that had no motive, that's like a drive-by shooting or something. But in detective fiction, of course, the murderer can never be the people that you suspect at the beginning, because then you would have no book. So that's not like real life, but that's what detective fiction is. So in this case, you know, the Hawaiians had to be suspected at the beginning, but you sort of know if you read detective fiction, it couldn't possibly be the Hawaiians. So in real life it could have been, but not in fiction. So I had the structural problem that just by looking at Dust Jacket, you would know that the Methow Valley was going to prove to be critical to the whole story. So the reader would know, picking the book up, that the Methow is going to figure in it big time. We didn't put a map of the Methow Valley in where we put the Hawaii maps, because we didn't want to overemphasize the Methow Valley part. But nonetheless, you know that's coming in some way. And of course, there's only one character in Hawaii on the Big Island who had anything to do with the Methow Valley. So consequently, if there weren't a lot of obfuscation and red herrings dragged across the path, the reader would know, you know, as soon as they got to that part in the very beginning, that there was someone there from the Methow Valley. They would know that was the murderer. So everything about Shark Cliff was brought in to both to create some narrative drive, but also to drag a gigantic red herring across the whole story. Everything about Joan Mallow, poor Joan Mallow. I think when you read the book and then you look back, you realize that whole Joan Mallow thing could have been left out, and there wouldn't have been any difference at all to the way the murder got resolved. So those were a couple of things that you do to try to postpone people coming to the recognition of who the murderer has to be. and create some suspense. But since I was going to write the book, I also wanted to communicate a few other things. I wanted to communicate things about Hawaii, the history of Hawaii, the situation with Native Hawaiians currently. The book is set in 2002, by the way, because that's when I started writing it, but also in 2002 was kind of the height of the intensity of the sovereignty and reparations efforts in Hawaii. And that all calmed down quite a bit in 2005 when Congress enacted something called the Akaka Bill, which created a variety of, for the first time, it created a lot of federal rights for Native Hawaiians. And that took a lot of steam out of the sovereignty and reparations movement. But at the time, there was pretty intense. That group, Sovereignty and Reparations, I have in the book, a little bit more over the top than anybody that was active at the time, but not too far. I mean, I had a lot of Native Hawaiians help me on the book, read the manuscript, give me corrections and things I had to do, and they all acknowledged that, you know, yeah, there were people like that in 2002 in Hawaii. So that I wanted to communicate some of that. I wanted to communicate some history of Hawaii, make people feel the enrichment that brings to an understanding of the Hawaiian Islands. And as I said, I was trying to avoid anything that was frothy and just, light beach reading. I also wanted to talk about race, having spent, 40 years, including 20 years as a homeowner in Hawaii, and having these Native Hawaiian relatives. I really believe that race, on the one hand, is it's a completely social construct. It doesn't have a biological basis at all. So it should be meaningless. It should be like hair color or eye color or something, but it's not. The salience of race is extremely high. And in Hawaii, which is the most melted of the melting pot places we have in the United States, the most racial diversity. And where you go and visit, everyone's nice to you, regardless of what color they happen to be. Nonetheless, racial divisions are acute in Hawaii, and they're very significant. And I wanted to bring race in, and I wanted to do it in a book that didn't have a single Black person or African American, so they could take that particular major subset of total racial stuff out of the book and leave it in the Hawaiian context. In the Hawaiian context, of course, the absurdity comes from the fact that there are no real Native Hawaiians. There are no pure-blooded Native Hawaiians, except on the little island of Ni'ihau, where there are about 250 who've been isolated there, and even their children, don't want to stay on Ni'ihau, so that there's very, very little Hawaiian blood or Hawaiian. There's a lot of Hawaiian ancestry, but not much Hawaiian blood. So you probably know the Mormon Church went out more than 100 years ago to Hawaii, and because of the way the Mormons think, that they do genealogies, and they spent 100 years doing genealogies on Hawaiians, and so every person who has Native Hawaiian ancestry is able to trace their Native Hawaiian ancestry. To be classified as a Native Hawaiian, you have to demonstrate that you had an ancestor who was on the islands before Captain Cook arrived in the 1770s. And it's very easy to do because thanks to the Mormon Church, the genealogies exist. But we're so far from the 1770s now that you can be Native Hawaiian, you can have one 526th part from that ancestor and 525 parts from people from San Francisco, and you can still decide that you're Native Hawaiian. This idea of a conflict within a person when you're 1/8 of one thing and 7/8 of something else, but the 7/8 of you hates the 1/8, or the 1/8 hates the 7/8, I should say. That's very real in Hawaii, and I was trying in part to draw Kabika as a young man into those kinds of complexities and difficulties, partly by giving him a Native Hawaiian girlfriend who actually is my favorite character in the book, but also by giving him a Haole girlfriend who represented something completely different. So he was torn as to his identity and torn in lots of different ways. And the two women were a way of dramatizing that for him, or heightening that for him, which also allowed me to have his father and his stepfather give him advice, have Patience's parents give her advice. I had a chapter in there in which Carolyn's dad gave her advice, but the editor needed me to take it out, so I took it out. So those were a lot of things that were going on in trying to put it together. And so that also explains why the book is, some people say it's very complicated, complex. I like to say intricate. I think intricate's a nicer, more complimentary word than complex. But my mother-in-law finished the book and she said, wait a minute. She said, I don't know who the murderer was. And I said, I told you, don't take 6 weeks to read the book and don't be drinking wine while you're reading it. I warned you. So she had to go back and read it again. But at any rate, those were some of the things that were going on as I wrote it. And I wrote it, finished it in 2002. We were adopting our daughter from China. She was arriving 5 years old and knowing no English. We had 2 other children and we both had full-time jobs. And so I knew if I didn't get the book done before she arrived, that I wasn't gonna have a chance to work on it. So I actually finished it the first time on the plane, flying home from Guangzhou with my new daughter. And it was done. I had the best agent in the United States. I had a real, I had confidence that I was about getting it published then, because the woman who was now the editor, who was then the editor-in-chief of Simon & Schuster, her first day on the job at Simon & Schuster had been as the publicist for my earlier book, The Dance of Legislation. So she just couldn't wait to get her hands on this manuscript. She had 6 exclamation points on her email saying, send it to me, the manuscript this weekend. I want to read it this weekend. And then on Monday, she rejected it. And so did everybody else. So I had the best agent. It was rejected by 6 really big publishing houses. And they all said the same thing about it, which was that the book lacked narrative drive. It didn't have narrative drive. At the time, it was 126,000 words, and it was meant to be a fusion of 2 genres. And on the day that I first put my finger to the keyboard, I said to my wife, I do not know if I can write a novel at all. So that's the first task. But if I can, I don't know if we can get it published, because nowadays publishing is all genre. It's all one genre or another genre. This book is 2 genres. It's meant to be a literary novel and also a detective story, or a literary novel with a detective, a murder and a detective. So it was 126,000 words because of my effort to do both of those 2 things, to have it be a literary novel and also have it be a detective fiction. So it was rejected, and it sat for 16 years until 2018, when one of my childhood friends, who happened to be a reader for a detective fiction press, a specialty press, not the one that published my book, but she was my lifelong friend, and she told me, you have to do this book, you've got to do it. And I said, well, here's the problem. It's 126,000 words long. I have to revise it to get narrative drive in there. And I know from reviewing books about how authors work, there's no author in the world who can do more than 2,000 words a day, and they throw away 1,000 of those the next morning. So when am I ever going to get 60 days to work full time on this book? It's just not possible. My life doesn't allow that. And she said, she laughed and she said, well, it can't be 126,000 words anyway. It can only be 85,000 words max. And I said, what? And she said, no, you can't publish a 126,000 word book unless you're, some really, really famous writer. No publisher's going to do that. So 85,000, that's what you're going to shoot for. Well, that actually was the liberating thing, because when I did read it again for the first time in 16 years, and I realized, well, heck, if you have to cut a third out of the book, that's actually easier than going through and cutting out line by line, this word and that word, and trying to get down to 85,000. So what I did was I jettisoned most of the literary part. There's incredible amounts of fine prose ended up on the cutting room floor. But I also jettisoned a lot of the Hawaiian part. So for example, I had one chapter, which I really cared about, which had really slowed things down, because unfortunately I'd put it in the front of the book before. And that chapter was Carolyn. It was Carolyn and her thesis, the thesis that she was writing in Hawaiian about Hawaii. And it was a description for her thesis advisor of what the thesis was going to contain. And in it, I had summarized, my own feelings, my own belief about how we should look at the ancient Hawaiians, how we should think about the ancient Hawaiians, and which was what her thesis was going to be about at the time. So that was a big chapter, like 7,000 words, wham, out the door with that one, and so forth. So I went through and I cut it down to about 80,000 words by just jettisoning a lot of stuff. And then I read through and thought, okay, well, where's the surgery? Where are the surgical scars? What do I have to do? And then I had to add things as well. So the whole Shark Cliff thing was not in the book originally. The Shark Cliff thing originally I added it in order to create some narrative drive. So I think when you open the book and you start reading about Shark Cliff, there's blood and there's sharks and stuff. It kind of can get you going in the book. And then at about this time, my wife decided she needed to sell our house in Hawaii because we weren't using it much anymore. Our family, our children had grown. We couldn't coordinate our schedules. Her parents couldn't travel anymore. We had formerly used it, among ourselves quite a few months of the year. Now we were just writing checks to the state of Hawaii. So I said, but what if the book's successful? What if I have to write a sequel? I got to have the house. I can't do it without the house. She said, I'll tell you what, if you find a publisher, I'll take the house off the market. Well, she sold the house in February and I found the publisher in March, so that the house is gone. Lost the house in Hawaii. But I did finally get it done. I got an editor. There was a long story there, and we whipped it into the shape in which you now see it. So I can dissect it some more, but I would be really interested in hearing your thoughts. I can tell you a couple of things that other people have said, which is really interesting. To me, it's interesting. Of all the people that have written me and all the book clubs I've talked to, where there's a discussion of any of the characters, Tanaka is a more popular person than I had thought he would be, or I didn't put as much emphasis on Tanaka as readers seem to. And I guess it's because Tanaka, for all his shortcomings, he stoutly defends Kavika, which seems like a really admirable quality for him to have. A lot of people were unhappy or expressed regret that Kavika and Patience didn't end up together. I'm surprised by how many.
Do you mind the spaghetti? When it comes to you need a colander?
That would be good, yeah. Okay. So there's a lot. This is good. We're getting a cooking thing going on. There's a lot of people commenting about Kavika, commenting about Patience, commenting about Tanaka. So far, nobody's commented about Carolyn. And to me, Carolyn's my favorite character in the book by far. Carolyn's the one person who kind of was culturally literate. Everybody else was culturally illiterate. She sort of sussed the thing out from the beginning. Her advice was good. She was a really strong person, I thought. But somehow she doesn't turn up in she doesn't occupy as much psychological space. One thing I learned about writing a novel, if I had never published, I'm glad I wrote a novel, because you learn things by writing a novel. And one thing I learned is that authors are not completely lying when they say the characters take on a life of their own. What happens with the character is that the amount of time that character spends in your head
cover the window.
is like
Is the
10,000.
spaghetti done? Do you know how to test it?
A character spends 10,000 amount of time in your head as it does on the page. So they become real people to you. And it's not that you can't write something that makes them do X or makes them do Y. It's that
What?
Anybody you know?
X or Y. This is fun, the commentary. It's that X or Y is not consistent with the character. You could do it, but it wouldn't be consistent with them. It wouldn't be consistent to make them do X, or it wouldn't be consistent with them to fail to have them do Y. But once you publish the book, the characters belong to the reader. They don't belong to you anymore. And so people have different interpretations of the characters than I did. Anyway, why don't I stop, let other people talk for a while. I can listen to you, or I can answer questions, which I'd be very happy to do. But let me emphasize again, I'm really flattered and honored that you would select this book and that you'd have me talk to you with you about it. And I'm very grateful for that. I do think, I told Jason Paulson at the Conservancy, I think this might be the only novel that's ever been published about a murder in the Metau, but it may not be. It may not be the only such book. But I wanted to do it. I should mention it. I should mention one thing about the Metau. Obviously, the two characters, the Native Americans, Jimmy Jack and Madeline John, those are not even Metau Indian names. Those are names of coastal Indians, but those are names of people I actually knew. I knew a couple named Jimmy Jack and Madeline John. I worked my way through college as a logger in the North Cascades, and we had lots of Native Americans. And Jimmy Jack was one of the guys that I logged with. A lot of the coastal tribes, they use patronymics. So Jimmy Jack, Sandy, Adam. Those were kinds of people that I logged with. So I thought those names were so delightful, I had to include them. And as you could tell from the acknowledgments, even though it is true that the Metau Indians had everything in there about the Metau Indians is true, except that
Done.
they didn't have any right to select land.
Do you know where the colander is?
In the Moses Reservation, and the wintering shelter didn't
Yeah, that's
convey
not-
any rights.
You need a bowl, I presume.
Give it a good,
Where's the bowl?
no, put it back in the container,
So where's
in the pan.
This hasn't happened to me before on a
So
book
where's the
club
bowl?
discussion, but it's kind of interesting.
the real colander?
It would be helpful if you need to talk about something unrelated to the presentation, please mute yourself temporarily.
There we go. Okay, thank you. All right, so let me stop. That's a long peroration to begin with. Sorry I was so long. It's early in the day, I guess. I can always go on.
Hi, I have a question.
Yeah.
I have a question, but first I'd like to make two comments. First of all, thank you so much for this novel. I learned a lot about Hawaiian culture, and I thought I'd always like to learn. I mean, I like murder mysteries and I like reading for fun, but I like to think I'm learning something at the same time. And I think you shared that extremely well and in an accessible and palatable way.
That's
and
what
the
I
other
like
comment
about,
is,
I like about murder mysteries. That's what I like about the best murder mysteries is they take you someplace, you know, or they take you to some time and you feel like you're learning about that. And I did want that, although there's really nothing in there about Hawaii that you couldn't find in a tourist book. Nonetheless, I tried to marshal.
not as much fun to read.
Yeah.
And the other comment is that I was struck by some parallels between your life and mine. I was an attorney and I am now a writer, and I write, or I have self-published 3 murder mysteries. And I'm struggling now to get a piece of historical fiction traditionally published. So I think your process, you know, the 20-year process, strikes a bell with me, and good for you for persevering. Now, my question is this the first of a series? I hope so.
Well, that question has bedeviled me for a variety of reasons. I actually have started on a sequel, so I'm maybe 15,000 words into a sequel, but the sequel is set in 2014, and so at which point Kavika is.
I only got up about 10 minutes ago because no, that's totally fine. I realized my.
I don't want to talk over her.
Wait a minute.
So I've gotten about 15,000 words into it. It's set in 2014, so he's now 42 years old, Kavika, instead of being 29. And I'm a couple of things. I realized I can't reproduce the first book. So I don't know if I can capture in the second book what I think is good about the first book. I don't know if I can replicate that or not.
Can I point out a real problem with writing murder mysteries these days? Because we have access to information so readily through our phones or whatever, you know, I put my murder mysteries in inaccessible places where people fail to charge their cell phones and there is no service. And that's the only way you can create the mystery, really. Good luck to you if you want to set it in 2014.
Well, a couple of things. I should have mentioned this earlier. One of the reasons that after I wrote the book, I was offered the opportunity to write an article about Hawaiian detective fiction, as long as I didn't mention my own book in the article, which I did. So I wrote kind of a survey of Hawaiian detective fiction that I called The Shark-Infested Waters of Hawaiian Detective Fiction. I posted that on the website that I have for my writing, which is called ericredmanwriting.com. The publisher wanted me to have a website, so I did that. But one of the big problems of Hawaiian writing anything in Hawaii, set in Hawaii, is that although the total number of Hawaiian residents is only 1.4 million. And of those, only 10% identify as Native Hawaiian. So only really talking about 140,000 Native Hawaiians. 2/3 or 60% of the people in Hawaii identify Hawaiian Pidgin as either their first or their second language. And I was not, as a mainland Haole, I was not about to try to write dialect, a Hawaiian dialect. And so that's why my main characters were all college educated, so that I didn't write that Hawaiian dialect. If any of you have heard the audio version, they found for the audio version a guy who's not a native Hawaiian, but he's a local Hawaiian, and he imparts the Hawaiian, the characteristic Pidgin lilt to the Hawaiian characters, which gives it kind of a comical or more of a lighthearted feel than the written book. But I like it a lot because he does it very authentically. He just can't pronounce any English words. He says Spokane and things like that just just make you. But he does a good job. The other reason I'm torn about the sequel is I'm still working full time, and I'm 73 years old now. I don't know how many more books I get to write, and I don't have time to just drop everything and just write. And I have another book I want to write, another novel, which is the one I started on back in 1975. I still want to write that one, which is a literary novel. And so I feel as if I've got to choose what I'm going to do in the little time I have available for writing, and B, I have to contend with the fact that my faculties are, I don't think I have any form of dementia, but my capabilities are definitely not what they were when I was in my 20s. I can read something I wrote in my 20s, and I can marvel at the vocabulary I had then and sentence structures I was able to create, things that I don't know. I don't know about you guys, but for me, there's not a week that goes by that I don't hear a word that from someone else that I used to use all the time. I think, God, I haven't used that word in years, and I could have used that word in the book. I just didn't think of it. So I feel there's a little bit of a race against time, and I have to make a choice. And I don't know exactly how to make that choice. I don't know whether I can write a sequel that is in my mind worthy of the first book. So that's the thing that's weighing on my mind right now. By the way, once I wrote my book and wrote that article about Hawaiian detective fiction, I learned something I didn't know, which is that almost all Hawaiian detective fiction is self-published, almost all of it. And these authors found me. I mean, I now have 15 books by authors who self-published Hawaiian fiction, and I'm reading one right now that's really good. So I didn't know anything about self-publishing. I had some snooty idea that you had to, get a publisher, or the book wouldn't be, reviewed, wouldn't be worthy. So I got a publisher, and it wasn't reviewed.
We like to call it indie publishing.
That's exactly right. It is indie publishing. It's exactly what it is. It's indie publishing.
No, I don't think. Well, how
Okay.
do you get on
I can
here?
see a
Okay.
hand waving on a sailboat. That seems great.
Yeah. This is Coco Blakesley. Al and I have, we lived in Hawaii for over 30 years.
Oh, wow.
And we've been on almost every island. And I can understand what you mean about the lilt of Hawaiian, how we speak Pidgin, because our girls can go from real English to Pidgin in a second.
Yeah.
And so a lot of that was missing in the book.
Yeah, we had, I just didn't, I think that writing dialect is very, very dicey.
Yeah, it is very
Number one.
hard.
And number two, I'm very sensitive as a Haole. I think there is ground that you just shouldn't try to tread that doesn't really belong to you. I would
think that I've read a lot of Hawaiian detective stories too, because we were there for so long.
Yeah.
And I can understand how you cannot put Pidgin in a novel. It's just a lilt of the Pidgin that's so hard to put across.
Yeah, I agree. I think that when I try to explain to people why you don't want to try to write dialect, it's just a bad decision to try to do that. I say go pull off the shelf, a Faulkner, a book of one of Faulkner's that you haven't read in 30 years. Just open it at random and start looking at the dialect that he uses for his Black Southerners, and it just makes you cringe. It just, it's just not. At the time, we had mental hierarchies that sort of allowed us to do that. But now I don't have that hierarchy. I felt that I had to leave that to the Hawaiians. Unfortunately, there are not many Native Hawaiian authors of fiction, not as many as you'd expect. And there's one local who has a very famous book that's really sold well in the last couple of years. He's not Native Hawaiian. It's called Sharks in the Time of Saviors. It's been a best-selling book, very well reviewed. Sort of fictional. It makes use of Hawaiian mythology.
Just a comment I was going to add. I enjoyed at first, Eric, I really enjoyed the book, but and the characters, but just the little asides too that Kavika does, where he's acknowledging that he's in a book. I've always enjoyed when authors kind of have their characters explore the literary aspect of the book, and so his side comments about, well, if this was a detective story, I really enjoyed that little aspect of it that you included.
It's interesting. One of the people I met after the book was published, my wife and I went back and visited because I had a lot of Native Hawaiians I had to thank, and Hawaiian locals I had to thank for the help that they had given me on the book, including, reading the whole manuscript and telling me things I needed to correct and so forth. One of the people I met is a woman who is on the faculty at University of Hawaii Hilo, and she writes murder mysteries, and she writes under a pen name. I asked her, I was thinking about the sequel. I thought, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to make her a character in the sequel, so that in the sequel, I have someone who's writing murder mysteries and is, talking with Kavika about, trying to get information for murder mysteries. And then they get to discuss the difference between murder mysteries and real murders and things. And so I asked her if it was okay if I made her a character in this book. I would move her to Honolulu and have her be a faculty member at University of Hawaii Manoa. But she was delighted. She said that'd be fun. So I'm going to do that if I do the sequel. I should mention, that reminds me, that the royalties I decided to donate to an endowed scholarship fund for Hawaiian language students at the University of Hawaii Hilo. They have a program there in Hawaiian language that is unbelievably impressive. It's the most impressive part of the university. And they're in what's called the third Hawaiian Renaissance right now, trying to, revitalize Hawaiian language and Hawaiian culture. And they are so good at what they do that center has now become the center for people from around the country who are trying to preserve indigenous languages. They send their people there to be trained in how to train teachers of those languages. So when I was there in May, the Ojibwe tribe had their people over there being trained about how to train teachers of the Ojibwe language so they could go back and work on their. So I thought that's such a worthy and interesting program. I decided that that's where the royalties should go. At the time, I was under the impression that there would be more sales than there apparently have been. So I thought the royalties would be more significant than they're probably going to turn out to be. But at any rate, it seemed like a worthy cause since I still have a day job, I don't have to rely on writing for an income. I assume that's true of you. If you're self-publishing murder mysteries, you probably have not been relying on that to get bread on your table either. I see Stella.
Absolutely right. No. It's a thrill when you get like a $7 check.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Stella.
I noticed that you have so many very small chapters.
Yeah.
And I as a reader, it was kind of nice because I can stop right now without, but I don't know why you did that.
Well, that came about, that was not intended originally. When I finally did get an editor, this was actually kind of a funny story. So Crooked Lane Press is a detective fiction specialty press, and it's mostly women editors. And by the way, most detective fiction that's published these days is written by women, and the detectives are women as well. So this one's kind of against the grain of the current trend. But the editor who looked at it was a guy named Ben Leroy, and it was his first book. He had just joined them. He had owned a couple of detective fiction presses and sold them very profitably to Random House and other places. So he just joined up. This was the first manuscript. he read the first 50 pages and he called them immediately and said that they had to give me a contract for this book. We had to have this book. And he even told them that it was the best written detective fiction that he had yet encountered. So they took his word for it and they gave me a contract and I signed it. It's not a very lucrative contract, but it's a contract. And I just wanted a publisher. And, but then he read the rest of the book and he hated it. He absolutely hated it. And he despaired because of what he had done. He was stuck with me on a contract and he just didn't like the book at all. So he told me that I was violating all these iron rules of detective fiction, which as far as I can tell are rules that he made up. But the book was written with, without my even thinking about it, it was omniscient observer, unlimited point of view. So I was Kavika's the protagonist, but I was in the heads of all the different characters or many different characters about what they were thinking. And he said, you just can't do that. Absolutely cannot do that. Only one character. It has to be omniscient observer, limited point of view, one point of view. The point of view has to be the detectives. There can't be any thoughts of any other person expressed and except to the detective. There can be no information the reader has, the detective doesn't have. So that has to all go to the detective when it goes to the reader. And this book just won't work. You got to redo it. Well, I wasn't going to redo it. The model in my head was actually my favorite novel of all, which is John Fowles' book, The French Lieutenant's Woman, in which the narrator is quite a presence in the book. And that was the other thing. He objected to my narrator because my narrator's voice wasn't just telling a story, but the narrator was expressing things. And but this point of view was the big thing. That was a rock on which the ship had wrecked. And he still had the right to turn the book down, even though I had the contract. And he just said, I can't publish it if you don't solve the point of view problem. So what I did was I compromised and I said, okay, how about I divide it into chapters, and in any given chapter, we'll only have one point of view, one character's point of view. But in order to do that, I had to chop it up. I actually think it's good. I think that benefited from that. I think it gives you the chance at at the end of each chapter to create a little bit of suspense that makes, person want to go on. It also gives you the chance to people to put the book down. I just finished this morning a book by Orville Schell, a novel by Orville Schell, which is almost 600 pages long. And, he could have benefited from having some shorter chapters and a shorter book. So it also, another interesting thing is it helps you write the book because you've got to keep track of everything. And keeping track of the whole book at one time in your mind is really hard. So you read it over and over again, and you run into inconsistencies. You run into things that you did that, contradict something you did earlier. So that, I think that helps because then you concentrate on a chapter at a time and you know where to flip back to and things like that when you're writing it. So in writing a sequel, I'm trying to do the same thing. I should also mention something else, which is in the first version, the 2002 version, which nobody wanted to publish. I had an epigraph for every single chapter. And that was also, the publisher said that really slows things down, those epigraphs. But I didn't want to give up the epigraphs. So what I did was I divided this book into parts that are kind of arbitrary. And then I have 7 epigraphs maybe in the book for those different parts. But to me, those epigraphs are important. Either they say something culturally that's important, or there's some parallel in the book. And as you know, I had to make use of the Father Brown story, the Chesterton story, and I had to make use of Edgar Allan Poe. So anyway, that's how the short chapters came about. And now that they're there, that's how I would write a sequel too. One reason we don't have 600-page novels anymore isn't just the cost of publishing books. It's that we live in an age in which all of our attention spans, not just those of our children, are just shorter than they used to be, right? Yeah. And that's why 85,000 words is like the limit for detective fiction. You think, God, that's a short book. Even Dance of Legislation was longer than that. But that's the way it is these days. And I think the short chapters are, when I was an oarsman, I rowed when I was in graduate school. And when you start the boat out, the boat's, at a standing start, you take a number of just really quick little short strokes to get the boat moving. And I sort of felt like, okay, I can do that with these short chapters. I can get the story moving. I can get the narrative drive. if anybody thinks it didn't have sufficient narrative drive, let me know. But I think we solved the narrative drive problem pretty well.
Thanks. That's interesting.
Eric, I have, if it's my turn, I have a question.
Sure, Patty.
So I'm curious about the character development of the two of Patience and Carolyn.
Oh, good.
Okay, and before I get to that, I was fortunate in graduate school in '75 to read your Dance of Legislation.
Oh my goodness.
And it really gave me a great foundation. Anyway, I love the book.
It gave me a great foundation too, because it was pretty suspenseful. You got to admit that was a suspenseful story. And I think that I sort of learned at the time, how to maybe convey some suspense. And I think that I was often conscious of that when I was writing this book.
Yeah, it was wonderful to read a book that was interesting during graduate school. So.
Yeah, I can get that too. Having been in graduate school.
I'm halfway through the book, so I'm appreciative to know the end. That's fine.
Sorry about
no, it's no big deal. As I read as I was thinking about the two characters, Carolyn, and I'm curious about your reasoning for having Carolyn. To me, fits sort of the stereotype of an academic or an intellectual and steady, reliable, bright, whatever. But I'm only halfway through, so maybe you develop her character more than that. And then Patience, in contrast, seems to be more lively, spontaneous, impulsive. They're both curious and they're both bright, which I appreciated. You made the characters, with the women, both bright and curious. So that was cool. But I was curious because I actually I found myself last night getting a little irritated with Patience, and starting to wonder if she was guilty of something, because her curiosity, even though she had passion for the detective, her curiosity seemed to be more exaggerated than I would expect in the moment so early on. So I began to question her legitimacy, her motives. And I couldn't tell if it was I was irritated with her or that Carolyn was made to be so I would identify more with Carolyn. That was be more me, So I was curious where my feelings were coming from. Was it how you built the characters, or, that I wanted Carolyn to have a little more liveliness, or that I was just like, Patience, you're really being a little unusual here with your level of curiosity. And so anyway, I've said enough, but you get the gist.
That's really interesting. Well, I would say a couple things. Number one, read on. Number two, for the major characters. So in my mind, the four major characters are Kavika, Patience, Carolyn, and Tanaka. And for those characters, I think I tried to, when we were in school, we were taught that a short story is like a snapshot that reveals character, and a novel shows character development, has an arc. So for those four characters, I wanted there to be an arc in their development. So that's why you kind of have to finish the book to see what happens with Carolyn and Patience. But Carolyn, to me, what she embodies is something that I think I feel pretty strongly, and that is she cannot reconcile herself to what Hawaii has become, because she feels the Native Hawaiian part of Hawaii so strongly. And so she has this kind of almost a despair. She needs to get over to Ka'ahulave and start planting trees that's what she needs to do, which isn't what she's studying at all. Patience I thought of as being, first of all, I tried to emphasize that she really was impatient. She's some sort of ADD sort of person. Secondly, I have a daughter who's ADD, so deprecating ADD people. But she's a journalist, and I think she has that inquisitive nature of a journalist. And also, she just extremely unexpectedly falls for Kavika, which is an unlikely match, and she knows it's unlikely. But nonetheless, there's some kind of magnetism there that draws her. So she gets involved in what he's doing, and she gets interested in that. It didn't occur to me until other people read the manuscript that anybody would think that she herself might be the murderer, she might be a suspect. So I was glad people pointed out to me that there were some people who thought that. So I did try to clear that up to make sure that people would realize, no, she's not a suspect. But she could have been a suspect, but she wasn't. But I don't know. I'd be interested in your reaction when you get done about what you think about the two women. I really cared about both of them a lot. And well, anyway, all these people that I shouldn't have talked about the fact what people are sad about how it comes out for Kavika and his love life, but obviously they represent diametrically different worlds for him. Carolyn represents the Native Hawaiian part very powerfully. And I mean, she's making the surfboard and things. By the way, I have that surfboard that she made. I have it in my hall here in Seattle. I brought it from Hawaii. I love that surfboard. And Patience represents the exact opposite. She's someone from the mainland. She's blonde. She's, definitely Haole. And represents a different world, which is part of it because he grew up in Seattle. And he has a Haole mom, and so he's attracted to that part too. It's part of the conflict he's got to try to resolve. Another iron rule of murder mysteries is you can't have love life in there, but he's got love life flowing out in all directions. So that's another rule that I broke. So I don't know. I'd really be interested when you do get done. I'd be happy to talk with you about what I'd like to hear what you think about about Patience and Carolyn when you get done. I had some.
Great, I look forward to that.
I had one book club where one woman said that she thought that my treatment of the two of them was sexist. And I was a little surprised by that because I had definitely intended to make them very strong. Carolyn's writing a PhD thesis in Hawaiian language, and Patience is a published journalist and stuff. But she said no, because in the book, they only exist in relation to the male character. And I thought about that a lot because since he's the protagonist, it's kind of hard not to have people, exist in relation to him. But she thought they didn't have enough independence, whereas I thought of them as being pretty independent women. They just happen to both love Kavika. But the person who really got treated badly, of course, is Joan Malo, the Joan Malo character. Yeah. But I have to say, I thought the treatment of Joan Malo was actually realistic. I mean, those things actually happened to people. What happened to her, and I think, and from years in Hawaii, maybe Coco would agree that you meet Native Hawaiian women who see an affair with some non-Native Hawaiian as some sort of opportunity to escape into something or other. And so I actually thought she was a realistic character, although she was terribly treated, obviously. Coco's got her hand up.
Am I on?
Yes.
You're on.
I think you did a great job with this blonde Haole girl from the mainland coming over to Hawaii. And, we lived there for so long that we saw this all the time. And they are very attracted to Hawaiian men. So yeah. I don't know if you know that, but I've seen it over and over again.
Remember that my wife's aunt and uncle both Howlands went out there and married Native Hawaiians, and I wanted to emphasize I think in sexual attraction,
it's definitely there.
Yeah, it's well understood that I think and widely understood that intensity of sexual attraction, when it's initiated, is usually based or often based on something that is exotic or something that seems forbidden. If you talk to gay people about what sex among gay people was like, 30 or 40 years ago. That intensity of the forbidden, the disapproved thing, you hear about that. Interracial sex.
The other thing
also
is, it doesn't work the other way.
It doesn't always work the other way.
Probably men, with Hawaiian women, it just doesn't work.
Yeah. There were a lot of in days when things were more hierarchical. There were a lot of Hawaiian women who were taken advantage of by haole men. I'm sure it still goes on today, but it's not the same thing.
Put your picture on. Yeah.
My daughter's from China. As I said, we adopted her when she was 5. And when she was a teenager, I was driving her along to tennis lessons. And each day there was a multi-part series on NPR about the problem that African-American women were having finding suitable African-American mates, because the African-American women were better educated as a group than African-American men. A lot of African-American men were in prison or were unemployed. And even though we had reached a point where African-American men, could easily, have relationships with white women, Asian women, whoever they wanted to have relationships with. So they had a universe of women available to them. African-American women felt that white men were not really attracted to African-American women. So the pool it didn't work both ways. And at that time, just as Coco said, I'm glad to say that I think nowadays it's working a lot more both ways, which is where we ought to go as a country. I read yesterday that 39% of Hispanic marriages in 2020 were with non-Hispanic people. That was a big increase from prior years. So I'm glad to see trends like that happening in society.
Well, I don't know if you could tell, but we have Hapa kids.
Well, as Carolyn says in the book, everybody's Hapa now. We're all Hapa now. There's a big difference. There's a big difference, though. So after I recommend another book that I think you'd find to be quite amazing, nonfiction book. It's called Honor Killing.
I've read it.
Yeah, it's an amazing book. So I thought I didn't have to read it because I knew about it. This is about the Massey rape and murder trial in 1931-32, where wife of an American serviceman, a sailor at Pearl Harbor, claimed to have been raped by 5 Hawaiian young men. And so the 5 Hawaiian young men were put on trial. They were acquitted. Among other things, there was absolutely no evidence that she'd been raped at all. But in a time in Hawaii, rape was a capital crime. There was a death penalty for rape. So they were acquitted. And after they were acquitted, one of them was kidnapped by the woman's husband and the woman's mother and some other and murdered. So then the white people were put on trial for murdering the Hawaiian guy. And Clarence Darrow came over and defended them. That was the murder trial. They were actually convicted of the murder, which was pretty easy to do because they had the body with them when they were arrested. But then the governor commuted their sentence to 1 hour of sitting in his office, and then they went free. But at the time, it created this huge national racial outrage. So you had all the mainland papers, the Hearst papers, and everybody else just screaming, about these Hawaiian animals, these Hawaiian brutes. White women weren't safe in Hawaii and so forth. And an amazing thing happened in Hawaii that we're still living with 90 years later. And that is, up until that day, hour, and minute, the planters and the major economic forces in Hawaii were white people, and they had successfully kept these different groups separate. The Chinese, the Japanese, the Filipinos, the Portuguese, they were all separate groups, contending with one another. And what happened as a result of the racism and all the events surrounding that trial is that for the first time, the situation we now have arose, which is that anybody in Hawaii who's not white can be a local. So the locals include everybody of every race other than white people. And that division between all the different races on the one hand and white people on the other, that's where it arose in Hawaii in 1931. And the book itself is an astonishing book. I really recommend it highly. I should look at these chat questions. See, Nancy says she did think Patience was the killer. So did my agent. So there we go. Oh, the audio version. It's also on Amazon, but I think I can actually, I own it. I think I can actually email it to you. If I have an email address, I could email you the audio version. Maybe, why don't you send me by email, since this chat will disappear along with the, since it'll disappear along with the end of the call, why don't, if someone wants to send them the audio, just email me. My email address is really easy. It's redmanseattle@gmail.com. And I'll see if I can just forward you, share the audio with you. It's worth listening to. It's good, but very different. All right. Have I exhausted everybody?
Well,
oh,
I was, oops.
Go ahead.
I was thinking, when you were talking, I was thinking about Hawaiian fiction, and one of my favorite rather racist books is Earl DeBigger's Charlie Chan books, and that's where I became really enamored with Hawaii because of his House Without a Door.
Isn't it so funny? People to think, this was in my article about the shark-infested waters of Hawaiian fiction. I did a survey article, and I talked about Charlie Chan. You know, I think most of us forget that Charlie Chan was a Honolulu detective, and we think of him as being Chinese, right? So we don't think of Honolulu. But the interesting thing about those books, you know, the reason that Beggars created Charlie Chan, now we think of Charlie Chan as this, you know, despicable racist image, but his motivation was that at the time, Fu Manchu was the image people had of Chinese people, and Fu Manchu was really evil, and he wanted to create a new image of Chinese people in America because he was really worried. It was a time of the Yellow Peril and all this. He was worried that we're going to get a lot of racism. So the irony is that Charlie Chan was actually created. His creator was trying to combat racism by creating Charlie Chan, and yet nowadays we think of Charlie Chan as being a hopelessly racist character.
Well, I think it's because of the stupid movies too.
Yeah, that's right. Because he was never played by a Chinese person in the movies. That's true. But he was modeled on a real life detective. There was a real life detective in Honolulu who was the model for Charlie Chan.
So I hope, I just want to make a comment. I hope Elliott Bay Bookstore puts you on for a reading soon.
They don't do these readings much anymore. They don't think they're a very successful way of selling books, I guess. But at any rate, they're being very nice and selling my book. But I don't think Elliott Bay is going to do that. I talked to them about it, and they said it just doesn't seem to work. Doesn't seem to create any benefit. But I can always talk to them again. There are lots of books that come out, and you go in, you write your own book, and then you go into the bookstore, and your heart kind of sinks. You see, there's so many books, and there's so many good ones. So every bookstore I've been to that has my book, I always end up buying a few books from the bookstore. It seems like a nice thing to do. And now I have this gigantic stack of books I've got to try to read. I've also discovered something horrible, which is when I start reading Hawaiian murder mysteries, I start running into things that I didn't want to run into because I have written about them myself or something. And the worst of all is when I was writing this survey article, there was a woman named Juanita Sheridan, and she had sold four best-selling Hawaiian murder mysteries in the 1950s. She was a best-selling author. She abandoned her child in Los Angeles to move to Hawaii and become a writer. And she wrote these murder mysteries with a woman detective and everything. But I opened one of them at random. I tracked them down, opened one at random, and then I just at random. And she ended a chapter with the word pilikia. And I had just written a book where I ended a chapter with the word pilikia, and I was like, oh shit, so I closed the book. I said, I'm not going to read this until I'm completely done with my book published so that I can read it and not have a plagiarism issue. And the one I'm reading right now, the characters suddenly stumble into the controversy over the 30-meter telescope. And in the sequel, the 30-meter telescope plays the role that the Heiau did in the first book. I'm thinking, oh Christ, I don't want to read this book now because I'm afraid I'll end up plagiarizing, from that book about stuff about the 30-meter telescope. So it's pretty funny. I think maybe most really good writers, maybe they just stop reading at a certain point. Okay. Oh, look at this. Getting all these nice suggestions. Vintage books in Bellingham. That sounds good. Paul Hansen, thank you for that suggestion. Yeah, the Trails End bookstore. I thought Deirdre was going to talk to them, and I would really like to have the chance, of course, to go over there. You could certainly, Jean wants to know if she can ask. I want to make notes of this stuff, but Third Place Books, Lake Forest Park, that's good. Trails End in Winthrop. Village Books in Bellingham. I hope I can remember that. Okay, Jean wants to ask a question about Tom Wales.
Yeah, I don't have the video on because I have very low throughput and it would freeze up if I did video. Yeah. So when I got to the section in the book about Stephen Kellogg being murdered, immediately I went, oh my God, it's the Thomas Wales murder.
You got it.
So then when I saw in the acknowledgements at the end, I was so sad, I started crying.
Well, it's been 20 years. It's been 20 years. That's the good part. But
so I wondered, and obviously you're living in Seattle, so you know this, but recently, maybe 6 months ago, the judge or prosecutors, I don't know the exact term, recalled this witness from 20 years ago, and she began to admit she had lied.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if
she was convicted. She was convicted too.
Yeah, and so I wonder if it's going to reveal who the real murderer is, and if he or she is still alive. I don't know.
Well, yes. The answer is yes. The real murderer is still alive. Second, that woman is actually an important witness. She was, at the time in 2001, she was the girlfriend of the guy who was the lookout man at the time of the shooting. And so he bragged to her about it, which is how things started to, how the investigation is still making progress, and it's along that line. So I think I'm just guessing, but it seems the obvious strategy of the prosecution was to charge and convict her, which they did in a plea deal, try to get her cooperation to be able to charge and convict the lookout man, and then have the lookout man presumably be willing to flip on the guy who pulled the trigger. But the guy who pulled the trigger was, I mean, this much is now public and understood. It was a contract killing. So when I wrote the book, we didn't know that it was a contract killing. We knew who was responsible, but we thought maybe he had done it himself. So in the book, the killer of the assistant U.S. attorney is someone who did it himself. He followed the advice that's in the book about if you want to get away with murder, this is how you do it. What happened in this case is, what happened in the Tom Wales case is not, it's easily described now, I think, which is that Tom was murdered on October 12th of 2001. So 1 month after 9/11. And it's hard for us to remember now that 20 years ago, the FBI didn't have homicide detectives. They were not homicide people. They did, forensics, they did organized crime, they did a lot of things, but homicide is a local crime. And what happened on the night that Tom was killed was that the Seattle police, the homicide detectives, knew exactly what to do, but the FBI stepped in and said, this was the prosecutor, so it's our case. And they took it over. They worked with the prosecutors, the Seattle police, but they made the Seattle police focus on trying to exhaust every other possibility than the person that they knew was responsible. And the FBI was going to concentrate on him. So the Seattle police that night wanted to go over and interview the guy who was responsible, the suspect. And the FBI said, no, you can't do that. We're not ready. And he'll just, he's not going to confess. And they said, of course he's not going to confess. But what you try to do is you try to nail him down. You try to get his story nailed down right away. And then you can pick away at that story. As it turned out, the FBI didn't interview him for 2 weeks. by that time he had worked out a lot of other things, and he's a very dangerous guy, and no one was prepared to testify against him when they thought that the prosecution wasn't going to be successful. And so you have people in this case who went to jail for 56 days rather than answer questions in front of the grand jury, just because they're afraid of this guy who's a very scary guy. But he's still alive. But I personally have taken a position with the FBI and with the Justice Department. Look, 20 years have gone by. You know what happened. We know what happened. The public has no idea what happened. You know it's going to be really hard to get a conviction. You want to get a conviction, but you won't bring a case to trial unless you're 100% certain you're going to get a conviction. And after 20 years of an investigation, the defense attorneys can take 5 or 6 years just going through all the stuff you've compiled. You know, you're years away from a trial, even if you decide to do a trial of the main guy. And meanwhile, no one, you know, the explanation of what happened is not there. And I said, I think that my own view is that you should take the risk of not getting a conviction, because from a family point of view, we'd rather have an unsuccessful prosecution than an inconclusive investigation. And I said, think about O.J. Simpson. So he was acquitted, but everybody ended up knowing who did it. His life, you know, he was burdened for the rest of his life by everybody knowing that. So in this case, but you know, they don't take advice from me. So I will say that every single U.S. attorney, every single attorney general of the United States in this whole 20 years, everyone has met with the family, with the exception of John Ashcroft, who was the attorney general at the time Tom was killed, and was not a fan of Tom, because Tom was also the head of Washington Ceasefire. So he was the head of a major gun safety group, and John Ashcroft didn't think that was a very appropriate activity. So Ashcroft never met with the family, but every other one has met with us, and some of them surprised you in private. Of all the people that surprised me in private, the one who surprised me the most was Sessions, because you could really see his personal qualities, how attractive he is on a personal level. So we spent half a day with him, and he's a very winning sort of person on a personal level, and he was very committed to this case. He's a former, U.S. attorney himself, and so he really committed resources to the case and was very dedicated to the case. And so it's kind of surprising when you meet with these folks. We haven't met with Merrick Garland yet, but I'm sure that day will come. So rather than trying the killer, they reassure you that they are trying to try the killer. That's what they do. Well, are we maybe done for the day, unless someone has something more they'd like to say or ask? I'm committed for the next 6 minutes to you guys, but if you want to save the 6 minutes for yourselves, we can do that.
Okay, I have something.
Oh, good.
You mentioned the Virginia. I never read that. I've seen the movie, of course, but that was pretty cool. And I'm going to read the Virginian. But how is that just because of the Methau Valley,
No.
or?
If you remember from my book, Kavika finally reads the Virginian when his mother gives it to him after he's come back to Seattle.
Yeah.
And I think that the Virginian, in addition to the Edgar Allan Poe quote, I think the Virginian kind of cements in his mind, that he finally understands what happened in the killing of Fortunato. I thought the Virginian was extraordinarily apt because of in the Virginian, a big deal is made out of the moral dilemma or the moral issue posed by lynching. So in the Virginian he works for Judge Henry. Judge Henry's a cattle baron, and some guys rustle his cattle, and the Virginian's job is to track them down, and he tracks them down and he lynches them. And the Virginian's girlfriend, who's the school teacher from Vermont, as she has to be, obviously, she's horrified at this, and Judge Henry has to try to convince her that this was a way of upholding the law in those circumstances and not defying it. but everybody recognizes that lynching seems like a defiance of the law. And he makes a big distinction between lynching Negroes, as he calls them, Negroes in the South, and lynching cattle rustlers, and trying to persuade her that, you know, she shouldn't be horrified by the fact that her boyfriend has done this thing. And that vigilante justice notion that's in the Virginian is the thread that led me to want to wind the Virginian into the meth house. But also, of course, in the meth house, we all have this myth that the Virginian was written about the meth house. I've even read some famous authors who said, yes, you know, that the Virginian is set in the Methow Valley, which is just not true. I mean, it's set in Wyoming, but the author did actually come to the Methow Valley. He was a friend of Guy Waring's, and he came out and was there. And there's one scene in the Virginian that definitely did happen at the while he was in the Methow, which is the baby switching scene at the dance. So the Virginian's well worth reading again. I mean, you know, how many novels are still in print after 120 years? It's a very, very good book. It's much better book than you would imagine it to be. Even if it's not really, even if it's not really about the Methow. Do you remember, if you've lived in the Methow a long time, you remember when the Virginian motel where Kavika goes first, you remember when the sign said the Virginian? You remember that, where they had the extra I in the sign for years, and we used to laugh and say, we got to go down to the Virginian. But they took that down and replaced it with one where they spelled it correctly. Probably too much abuse. I had a few little scores to settle in the book, and I wanted to get in the fact about Ted Bundy having been worked for Dan Evans. And the reason is because when I worked for Senator Magnuson, he just would always shake his head about this. He said, can you imagine if Ted Bundy had worked for me? He said, every single newspaper article about Bundy would say, former Magnuson aide Ted Bundy this, you know, former Magnuson aide Ted Bundy that. Instead, you had a former Dan Evans aide who never, I mean, Dan Evans was Teflon when it came to Ted Bundy. So I did want to get that in there because that actually was in a Methow tourist guide that I saw. So I thought, okay, that's fair game. I also told that, you know, Ted Bundy, that there were a whole bunch of the bodies that were never found. And there's one guy who devoted his life to trying to find those bodies, a detective who also did the Green River Killer case, Robert Kepler, he just died recently. And I said, you know, you figured out that Ted stored a bunch of bodies along Route 18, but I'll bet you, considering that he drove Evans over the North Cascades Highway before he started murdering as many people as he did, I'd be surprised if some of those bodies might not have been along the North Cascades Highway, and Kepler had never thought of that. But that's just a little bit of a trivia. We can end on Ted Bundy, this whole conversation, another murderer. Well, thank you so much for doing this. I really, really appreciate it. You know, it's a tremendous thing to have other people read your book. That's what you write it for. So, and those of you who haven't finished, go ahead and finish, even though now you know a lot, but you don't know everything. And if you send me an email, I will try to see if I can send anyone who'd like to see the audio. I will get the audio. I will see if I can send it. I believe I can just email it to people because the way those audiobooks work, you own it once you download it. Okay, thank you all so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you so much.
I hope I get to see you over there. And Lincoln, you know, if I have to go to Hawaii to see you, that would be even easier for me than getting to the Met House sometimes. But I don't know about Kauai. I mean, what Patience says in the book is true about South Kohala. Everybody at South Kohala says we all have this thing in common. We all used to go to Maui or Kauai.
Eric, actually, most of the time I'm in Mazama.
Ah, good for you. I envy you. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, thanks so much.
Oh, and do spread word by word of mouth. That's the only, and if you like it, take a little time, put a little short review and some stars on Amazon. If you don't like it, don't do that. Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.
All right, bye everybody.
Bye.
Bye.